Welcome to our next video, which is going to provide some background information about Exodus chapters 15 to 40. This is describing God's vision for Israel to represent Him to the world. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion that I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these significant chapters. So let's get started. Exodus is also two parts. Some break into three, but I see it primarily in two parts. There's Israel in and journey from Egypt. We looked at that last time. And then there's the journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they're going to camp out for a while. The characters in the story, God, the all-powerful deity, we saw that through the miracles and the judgments. He wants to partner personally with his people, though. And so that's where Moses is a key character. He's this conflicted main character, though. He's faithful to serve God's purpose, and he does it by freeing the Jews. That was 1 through 15. And now he's preparing them to become a nation, which was promised to God's people from Abraham. So it's been a long time coming. We saw Pharaoh was the clear villain, the antagonist. And he hardened his heart to anything Yahweh wanted. He opposed God's will, his people, and so he was defeated so that Israel, the people, could serve God. That was the key. And so when we look at Exodus, kind of the main idea here, it really opens the story to this evil world resisting God's plan. And so God sends Moses to rescue his people. We looked at that last time. And now we're going to look at the second part to create a covenant between them and God. Excuse me. And really, we learn how God wants to dwell with his people, to partner with them. And so we're going to look at that now in the second half of the book. And so this is, again, starting at 15:22. I'm just going to quickly just kind of walk through this, the timeline and characters. I break it into three parts, Act 1, 2, and 3. There's that transition from Egypt to Mount Sinai that's preparing them. And we really see the focus move from that oppression we saw in the first 15 to now this formation of the Jews into God's people to become a nation. And so the Act 1 is really first steps forward for the Jews. They're journeying to Mount Sinai. God's working through Israel's rebellion. So you see these stories of rebellion, and yet they move forward. They keep moving forward. And he's using those situations to prepare the Jewish people for their climactic moment, which is chapter 19. Some scholars refer to chapter 19 as maybe the most pivotal moment in all of the first five books of the Old Testament, the Torah. It's when they arrived at Mount Sinai to officially become God's people. And so that's where we see Act 2 and 3 happen. Act 2 begins with Yahweh saying, "I am your God." I think that's chapter 20. And he identifies with them. He established the law with them as a covenant to commit himself to them as his people. And they in turn are going to recognize Yahweh as their God. And then that builds towards Act 3, which is when Yahweh establishes a place for himself in the tabernacle for his presence to dwell among his people. And it's so that they can partner together. Again, he wants to work with them to bring blessing to this world. And so if you looked at kind of the general plot, God's really seeking a relationship. He's the one moving things forward. He commits himself to them. He dwells with them. And it's so that the world encounters the blessing of God. Now, as we're looking at the story now, it's really focused on God, his people, and then towards the land. And that's maybe, why is land so important? Why is this so important, having a law? In that culture, a true religion required three things. It required a divine being, a God, a people, and a place. And so God's working within that framework to make himself known. Again, that was the key theme that we saw in the first 15 chapters. I think that theme continues, that he wants to be known. He wants a relationship, and he does it in a way that makes sense for that time. And so by committing himself to the Jews, he's got the law. He has this portable box, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting for him to dwell. They're going to step forward on their journey towards their final stage, this moment when they find themselves in the promised land. And that's really for God to be recognized as the true God. And so let's look at Act 1 of Book 2 for Exodus. And so what we see here is a significant transition in terms of the scene. So when you think of how a story is presented with a timeline and a location, this section really begins the desert narrative. So Israel just crossed the Red Sea, and now they're going to remain in the desert for the remainder of the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So it's not until the book of Joshua, which is 3 books away, that they're going to cross the Jordan River into Canaan, the promised land. And so as we begin, even though we've been building towards this moment when, Abraham's family, was given the promise to become a nation, that we're kind of waiting for this to happen. When you're looking at what's going on for Israel, they were just reacquainted with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, having just been delivered from oppression and then, being in this new, stage in the desert, we really need to see this as a new kind of section for God's people. It's almost like if you think of God's people as, a child, it's almost like they've been birthed, and now this is the beginning of their toddler years, where God's taking them by the hand and he's patiently teaching them how to walk with him. And God's explaining who he is, what their life will look like together. And so as we read these stories, don't just see the complaints of a rebellious people. It's really a demonstration of God's care to prepare his people to become his representatives to the world, because that's where he's going, is he wants them to represent him. And so we see, as we look at this section, there's a lot that's there. And I appreciate you, Carl, bringing that to our attention, just the significance of just how God keeps showing up. And so in 15:22 to 17:7, there's 3 stories, and they deal with the grumbling that's going on because there's a lack of food, there's a lack of water. And so you see the first and the third stories are about their deliverance from thirst. And then the second story is a deliverance from hunger. And so it's just amazing that, I think you mentioned this too, Carl, that within months of leaving Egypt under the most miraculous of circumstances, they forget and they return to their old habits, void of any faith in God's ability. And so they again use their perception of what they see to determine their view of God. And so amidst their grumbles, God hears them. He uses their complaints as an occasion, not to punish them, but to teach them about himself. And so you see that as an example in verse 12. It says, when he's sending the manna and the quail, it says, know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. So it was more than just the manna and the quail. It's to remind them that God's there. He's with them. He's providing. And so God is not yet finished teaching his people. He's using these circumstances as lessons for them. And it continues. And he has more to teach them. So Exodus 17, verse 8 to 16, we encounter another act of deliverance in the desert. This time it's with the Amalekites. And so it's foreshadowing what's to come in the promised land. But more importantly, God's revealing to them how their grumbling isn't just problematic in terms of what it does to the people. It's also dangerous. And so Israel must learn that their real enemy isn't within, in the people of God. They have plenty on the outside to worry about too. So they got to grow up, and they got to do it quickly, because the world system still stands opposed to God's will and working with the people. And then the last story before they get to 19, it's a culminating scene in chapter 18 before they arrived at Mount Sinai. So they're on this journey and they're struggling, but they're moving forward. And in contrast to the Amalekites in 17:8, they came to attack and destroy. Jethro in 18:5 through 7, he comes and greets. So you see this contrast between Jethro and what he's doing and the Amalekites and what they did. And Jethro, in contrast, is coming to restore order and help Moses build a greater unity for the people. And so it's trying to bring the people together, preparing them for chapter 19 at Mount Sinai. And first, it's that there's the word of Yahweh's victory is spreading. And so Jethro comes to really remind God's people to praise their God. He's the one that God uses to help Israel really see what they forgot, that God's working with them, he's with them, he's providing. And then the second thing is after, reminding God's people to praise God, Jethro sees how Moses is in over his head. And so he calls on Moses to get help. And so he's doing that so that Moses sees this work is too large for any one man, and he needs qualified leaders to work with Moses to bring order and unity. And so as we come to the close of the chapter, it's like the Israelites are prepared. They're ready to approach God at Mount Sinai. And so that's what we see in chapter 19. This is such an important chapter in the story. It can't be overstated. It's really the pivot from deliverance from evil to a new life with God. And God's purpose for this people, for them, is to represent him. And so it's not just to deliver them, it's to represent him to a world that needs a blessing, that needs restoration. And so it's an interesting transition point. And what do we see? We see that God describes them as, number one, his treasured possession or his favored people. Number two, he calls them a kingdom of priests, or a people who stand between God and the world to bring every people to God. So as a people, they are to be a kingdom of priests. And then they're a holy nation, which doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean separation from. They were in the world. It means distinction. It means that they are to point the world to God. And so this people is to change and grow to be like God so that they represent him to the world. And so first, this responsibility is so important to God that his covenant starts with his unconditional commitment. So it starts with God. He initiates, he forms a partnership. But as it is a partnership, the reality of this means that it's only realized and experienced in the world if God's people listen and obey. So the obedience results in the experience of this partnership for God's people if they listen and obey. The second thing is this responsibility is humbling, and it's humbling for this people as they enter into a relationship with a dangerous God. He speaks from a storm. He cannot be tamed. And so even though God wants them to become a kingdom of priests, inviting them to climb the mountain in verse 13, this is key. The people are too afraid. They don't go up. And if you look ahead to Deuteronomy 5:5, they emphasize this sense where God's people didn't go up. And so in response, God identifies Moses as a mediator between a fearful people and an awesome God, so that this partnership can be dedicated and blessed by sealing the partnership, the covenant. And all this to say is God's people can represent God to the world because God is committed to them. He meets them where they're at, even in their weakness when they're too afraid. And he works through the people as God's seeing them grow and change to be more like his representatives, because that's where he's moving. And so really see how this desert narrative, the movement from the miraculous and the judgments to now this being faithful and moving forward in this barren land, that God's moving them forward to become his representatives. And so God cares, and he's seeing change through these circumstances. As we move into Act 2, and we see this God who, his plan from creation was to have a good world. And so now God's plan for restoring creation, which began with a covenant to Abraham. Now think that's a single individual. It now has grown to include a people. And so they've been fruitful, they've multiplied, and they've been journeying to meet with God now at Mount Sinai. And so what's next? What would, God's revealed him, he identifies with them. Well, it makes sense that it's the giving of the law. Every nation needs laws. And so this section of the Bible describes more than a spiritual reality. I think that's really important to see. As you read through the law, some of them can sound very strange, but it's not just a spiritual reality. it actually includes some civil and criminal legislation, the same word that we use when we think about our government, and it's to guide this new people as a nation to move forward. And so he's building upon the leadership structure of chapter 18. And now God himself, and that's so key in this, God himself gave a legal code to this people that, if kept, would ensure his blessing on the nation. You see this in Exodus 15:26, see it in 23:25 to 26, that God is emphasizing that it's for a blessing. And it's so that, as he told Abraham, it's blessing you to bless the world. And so to fully appreciate the Mosaic Law, though, I did some reading on this to compare it to other ancient Near Eastern law codes, the Code of Hammurabi. I'm going to butcher these, the Middle Assyrian laws, and then the laws of Eshuna. But I think as we kind of look at God's law, we need to compare it to other laws of that time, because culture shapes so much of how those were written. And so I want to look at the biblical laws and comparing them to the ancient Near Eastern laws of that time. And so these are things that I got from my professor, Dr. Bayless, and he said that there's really 4 differences. The first one is, if you look at the biblical law compared to these other ancient Near Eastern laws, it places a primary concern on human life. And so the destruction of human life, unless accidental, always requires capital punishment. But if you look at other law codes, if there's a monetary compensation, or if there's a life lost, you can give a monetary compensation, which really makes humanity more of a transaction, where in the law code of the biblical law, it's an eye for an eye. And so when you think of that other law codes, you can pay for a life lost. It's especially in cases where someone's a lower member in society. It really degrades human life. And so that's to show that the biblical law places a human life on a high plane. And then what do you see, number 2? The biblical law involves eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That's kind of the motto you see in Exodus 21 and verses 22 to 25. And so what this does is it advocates for equal justice for all. Additionally, the Bible does not allow kids to be punished for the wrongs of a parent. You'll read, as we looked at in the 10 Commandments, it talked about how there can be evil that's passed down. That's more of describing what happens when you don't obey God and you don't teach your kids to do that. It can be passed down where they don't experience God's blessings as a result of this, because you see here that in the biblical law that we're each responsible for our own actions. And so it doesn't allow kids to be punished for the wrongs of a parent. In the Code of Hammurabi, if a man killed another man's daughter, the murderer's daughter is put to death. And so that's not how the biblical law works, and makes it distinct in that way. So primary concern on human life, eye for eye. And then the biblical law judges crimes against property more leniently, especially, for example, the Mosaic law normally requires double restitution for theft, where others, it's even more. And so it really is just showing just a lot of grace in that. And then the last one that I think is why it can kind of be tricky to understand the biblical laws is that there's also worship practices. Other codes do not, because they're understood as a product of a king seeking to please his God by formulating just laws. But here, Israel's law is directly from God. And so there's no distinction between civil and religious. All laws are religious because they're all from God. And so as we understand God's law, the Mosaic law, this is kind of how it's framed. It's divided into the Decalogue, which is the 10 Commandments, and then it moves into the description of the covenant, and then into the tabernacle. And so you see, some people will divide, and this is helpful. It's not that it isn't true, but you'll see modern categories. There's moral, there's civil, there's ceremonial, but that's not how Moses outlined it. And so I just want to kind of bring that to your attention. You can, in the explanation in our time, you can say, well, this is more moral, this is more civil. but we get in some trickiness in that, because that's not how Moses was dividing it. This is how he did it. So first comes the Decalogue. That's Exodus 23 through 17. These are not moral absolutes or requirements in the sense that he talks about Sabbath, for example. And as we look at the New Testament, Paul writes specifically about the Sabbath, that Romans 14, 5 through 8, Colossians 2, 16 through 17, that Sabbath is a matter of conscience, not a law. Now, what these 10 commands are doing, they're summarizing the main concerns of the whole law. And I think there is a standard of morality in described that we don't lie, we don't kill. I think those are moral absolutes. I just am trying to bring out that we have to be careful to say, well, the 10 commandments were moral, this over here was civil, because even in the 10 commandments, there's a description of there's no other gods, which is more of a religious law. And then there's also the Sabbath, which is more of a religious law. So Moses, when he was doing this, his categories were different, and he's just highlighting and summarizing the main concerns of the whole law from the 10 commandments, which, if you had to break it down to one word, it really is faithfulness. If you had to understand what the whole law is about, it's faithfulness to God, it's faithfulness to your community, and then it's faithfulness to your family. And so this makes Israel distinct from the nations surrounding them as they worship the one and only God, Yahweh. He is to be respected by following this standard. And so it's really important to see that God gave these laws to really form this people. And also, to run a country, you need more than stated principles or general rules, which is what the 10 provide for us are kind of more general. And so he gets more specific as the law is written. Now, as we move into the second, from the Decalogue, the 10, to the Book of the Covenant, here we find the specifics on obligations and punishments needed to implement for a just society. So this is where you see some criminal, some civil laws, as well as religious laws as well. And so that's to get more specific, to be clear on what it means to obey. And so that was really helpful to define what God's expectations were. And then the third part, the tabernacle and worship, that's towards the end. And these are directions for the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting, to be the central place of worship for Yahweh. And so this is what's going to be covered more in the third act. But I just wanted to really just kind of highlight kind of the purpose of the law, what it was doing, as a mix of civil and criminal, legislation with religious, to form this new people. Because again, this is to help define what does it mean to represent a united nation around Yahweh who's present and faithful to them. And so when we get to Act 3, the revelation of the name Yahweh indicated the promise of his presence with his people. So he's there, he's with them. And this is guaranteed in the Mosaic covenant by the tabernacle. And so the tabernacle is the place of worship and accountability to God. But even more important, it's Yahweh it says in chapter 29, verse 43, he's going to meet with the Israelites. And it says he will dwell among them and be their God. And he says that they will know that I am Yahweh, who brought them out of Egypt so that I might dwell among them. And so while God informs Moses about the construction of the tabernacle, its furniture gets specific, while that's happening, the Israelites make a calf idol and worship it as the God of Exodus. In chapter 32, we've talked about this. And it's really just a horrible moment where it's more than just rebellion. It's reversing all that God has done. And it's because of this demonstrated tendency towards disobedience, the Lord proposes that Israel would be better off without him. And so you see how God's like, okay, I don't need to be a part of this. And so everything's hanging in a balance at this moment. And so he says he'll give him the land as he promised, but without his presence. For otherwise he'll have to judge them more strictly. You see that in Exodus 33, 1 through 5. And so what does Moses do? He recognizes the significance of Yahweh's presence for them to be this blessed, chosen people. And so they need him. And so Moses stands in the gap and reminds God of his promise. They not only need the Exodus and the land, they need Yahweh. They must have his presence. You see that in Exodus 33, 12 through 16. And so as we've talked about, I think Judy, you've talked about just how Moses is just this incredible leader. His role as mediator in chapter 32 shows us what it looks like to represent God. It shows the people what it looks like to represent God, to partner with God as his image bearer, the image bearer that was described in the very beginning when God created humanity. Moses shows us what that looks like. And so God wants to destroy Israel. He says they're Moses's people. He's like, they're your people. And so Moses pleads to God and saying, they're God's people. To this point, God has said they are my people. He even used familial language to identify with Israel. But now, because of the calf and what they did to reject God, and not only reject God, but attribute what God did to a golden calf that they created. And remember too that we're talking about the tabernacle. So tabernacle is where God's going to dwell. And so the golden calf for ancient Near Eastern time, that was kind of like a footstool for the gods to dwell. And so it's making a contrast that this is going to be the new gods who are going to dwell with Israel that did the work of Exodus, which is just horrible. It's almost like you see as horrible as, present day, when you think of a family and what it does when there's a divorce, how it breaks up a family. That's really what we're seeing here is that there's a potential for a divorce. And so what does Moses do? He steps in and he pleads to God, saying they're God's people. He argues to God that destroying Israel isn't consistent with his character. And he argues that it's not consistent with his promise, especially all of what he did to rescue them from Egypt. And so why would he stop now? And so there's something deep that we're learning about the nature of God. He made promises to bless humanity despite humanity's continued failing and disobedience. It would have been just for God to leave such a disobedient humanity, but he promised to Abraham, and he promised to Jacob, and he promised again to the people of God how he is with them, he is for them, and so he promised them, and so he continues with them, because it would be unjust for him to break his promise. But that's what's so incredible, is how this story invites us into this struggle that even you see God sharing with Moses, this rocky relationship, seemingly rocky relationship between God and man. And so you're left with such an appreciation for Moses, how we need someone like Moses. He's just this exceptional human being, and we need more Moseses in our life. And so all said, Yahweh relents. He agrees with Moses, and he shows that he is also the presence of God is necessary to Israel. He sees that, and not only for judgment, but of compassion, of grace, of faithful love. You see that in Exodus 34, 5 through 7. Let me just read that to us. It says that the Lord passed over him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. And he talks about, the iniquity that happens upon us when we disobey. The emphasis, though, is on his forgiveness, his compassion. And so might that be who we see God as, is God who is compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love. And so among these people, he's going to do wonders, quote, never before seen in any nation. That's in chapter 34, verse 10. God is going to do something wonderful. And the book of Exodus closes with the glory of Yahweh coming to inhabit the tabernacle. I mean, what a privilege, what a grace that he's there with them in the desert, in this barren place. And so the tabernacle reminds us how much God wants to dwell with us, his people. Despite our rebellion, despite our failings, he is there with us. That's what we learn from the book of Exodus. And just to bring it into conclusion, so God makes a covenant. He commits himself to them through the struggle, and he's dwelling with them to shape his people to represent him. Now, the problem is what we talked about. Israel breaks the covenant. We see that in 32. And so Moses intercedes. He keeps interceding based on God's promise to them. And so God shows mercy. But notice at the very end of Exodus, when it's talking about God's presence, his glory coming down, Moses is called by God to enter, but he is unable to enter, which creates the question, well, why is he unable to enter? Well, that question, why is he unable to enter the tent of meeting, is answered in the book of Leviticus that gives much of the ceremonial law, which it gets into how God is distinct from this world. And so we need to in a sense, meet him where he's at as he's met us. But we're to meet a holy God that's much like the sun, that there's a purity in his presence. And so that's why there's these ceremonial laws. And then at the end of Leviticus, you see that Moses is able to answer that question and he's able to enter, which leads us into the book of Numbers that we're going to pick up next. That's where there's the movement from Mount Sinai towards the promised land.